purpose of this video is to introduce you to a little bit about what you're going to be doing in the performance task, which is doing what scientists do when they're trying to find homologous structures, similarities between different species, as well as a little bit about how they actually draw out those similarities. So, common ancestry. I've used that term a lot in the previous video. Common ancestry is this idea that all organisms on Earth use the same building blocks, the same genetic codes. We all have DNA and RNA, and it all has the same 4 bases. And that on a molecular level, many of the structures in cells are homologous no matter what organism you pick. You can pick any group of organisms, any ones you want, and you can find at least some homologous structures in that organism. Any creature at all. Many of the amino acids that are needed to sustain life are also the same from one creature to the other. Now, that doesn't mean you are the same as a whale. You're not. You are not a whale. You don't look like a whale. You don't act like a whale. You don't think like a whale. You're not a whale. But that doesn't mean there's not similarities at a molecular level to prove common ancestry. Ancestry as in like millions of years ago. So in the last video, we talked a lot about homologous structures in the form of bones, but it's not just about bones. There are also homologous molecules, which are species that share many genetic similarities, and as a result are considered to be more closely related than 2 species that have many more differences, just comparing the molecules before we even look at the bone. And the 2 types of molecules that a scientist will look at are homologous proteins, which will share certain structural and chemical similarities, and homologous genes, genes that code for similar traits, such as bones and bone structure that we talked about in the previous video. So if you look at the diagram down below, you'll see how scientists in this situation are trying to compare the genetic sequence, the amino acid sequences in a fly to a mouse or a human. And so what they've done is they've color-coded the different structures that appear to have some kind of similarities, and then they've laid them out here in rows, and they've shaded where they think they have a string of very common amino acid sequences, very common genetic code. Where they haven't shaded, they've decided there's not a really strong comparison there. So that's where evolution has really changed a fly from a mouse and a human. And if you look at the entire sequence, you can see there's a much more difference than there is similarities. But they did find some similarities, and the only way they could do that was by comparing their genes, their amino acids, their genetic code, which is something you're going to be doing in class. So the last thing I want you to know about common ancestry has to do what you're about to do in class. This is going to teach you how to read a diagram like the one you see on screen. So one of the ideas of common ancestry is that the process of descent with modification suggests that 2 species that diverged from one another relatively recently in the history of life on Earth will share more genetic similarities than 2 species that diverged from one another further back in time. So what does that mean? That means when you look at a diagram like this, it's trying to show you how closely related each of these organisms are. And how we know that is based on how far back in time do we go to find the common ancestor between any 2 of these. So the first thing you have to know, and you would write this on your note sheet, is every time you see one of these joints where there's a split, that's a node. So right here we can count the nodes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 nodes. And that's going to help us determine how closely related any of these are. Because you can't just count the tips. You can't just go, oh, humans are further away from old world monkeys than orangutans because they're farther away at the tips. No, that's not how you do it. So let's look at an obvious one of how to do it. How to tell how closely or far related any 2 organisms are that have a common ancestor. And that common ancestor is back here. We may not know what it is, Oftentimes we don't, but we do know that there is a common ancestor that shares a lot of DNA between all of these animals here. So humans and chimpanzees are the most closely related creatures on this list here. That doesn't mean humans come from chimpanzees or vice versa. It just means they share a lot of DNA. Now, gorillas are not as closely related to humans as chimpanzees. Gorillas have less in common genetically with humans than chimpanzees do. But gorillas have the same amount in common genetically with chimpanzees as they do with humans. And we know that because gorillas are 2 nodes away from chimpanzees and 2 nodes away from humans. So that's why you can't just count the tips, because you might think gorillas are more closer to chimpanzees than they are to humans, when in reality, gorillas are just as far related from chimpanzees as they are humans. They share the same percentage of DNA as both those, because gorillas are 2 nodes away from both of them. Gorillas are 3 nodes away from gibbons and siamangs. So that's why gibbons and siamangs, we know that they are more closely related to this common ancestor right here and old world monkeys than they are to gorillas, because we're counting the nodes. So that's how you can tell how closely related any of these organisms are to each other, is by counting the nodes. Don't count the tips. If you count the tips, sometimes you get lucky, but sometimes you'll be wrong. So don't count the tips, count the nodes. This is a fairly complex part of the performance task, but if you have any questions, always ask me in class, and thank you for watching.